The ABC seeks to treat Indigenous cultures and beliefs with respect. To many communities, it is distressful and offensive to depict persons who have died. Indigenous communities which may be offended are warned that the following program may contain such scenes.
Sydney, New Year's Eve. A picture of excess and indulgence. The harbour city is the ultimate symbol of our new wealth. Australia boomed in the 1990s. Nearly everyone is better off. The dollar is worshipped as never before.
I knew we were smashing the old mould. These years were about stripping the economy down to make it more supple and internationally competitive.
I don't think in any other peacetime period did you get such a dramatic transformation of Australia's economic base.
The Hawke and Keating 1980s revolution turned Australia on its head. But as Australians celebrated this new culture, not everyone was sharing the prosperity. Wealth and inequality are growing together.
We're losing a sense of fairness. We're losing a sense of fair play. We're losing the whole idea of an egalitarian society.
A 100 years ago at Federation, the Australian instinct was egalitarian. One man was as good as another.
The country has no aristocracy of its own. The people dine well, drink well, gamble well. The working classes have the confidence of numbers. Even in Australia, which has not been civilized very long, men are sweating in factories and toiling in coal mines. They are aiming at improved mental and material conditions of living. Alfred Buchanan, journalist.
The Australian dream was to create a working man's paradise. A new government was being created within a new nation. Australians looked to government to deliver their bounty.
There was always rich and poor in Australia. But what was different was our belief in a fair go. From its inception, Australia tried to civilise capitalism, but tried to make capitalism fairer. In this cause, we built a tariff wall, a system of wage fairness, and vast public enterprises. This faith was shared by both sides of politics and lasted for 80 years. But when the world changed, when the old policies no longer worked, Australia had to reinvent itself. This program is the story of that transformation.
Hugh Victor Mackay's Sunshine Stripper Harvester was an ingenious machine. It combined stripping and winnowing in the one machine and revolutionized the wheat industry. By 1901, Mackay was making more than 500 harvesters and employed several hundred workers.
The combined harvester is a purely Australian product. Australians undoubtedly make the best machines in the world. And it will largely be the fault of our legislators if foreign manufacturers are encouraged to profit by our inventions and discoveries. H.B. Mackay.
Mackay became a champion of a great Australian tradition, tariff protection for local industry. It was the first battle that shaped Australia's future, protection against free trade. Leading the protection charge was Victoria's finest politician, the Liberal Alfred Deakin, an ambitious nation builder.
No one could talk the language of culture with better accent and discretion. When he went upon a platform, words flowed from him in a silver stream. Alfred Buchanan.
Opposing Deakin was the free trader from New South Wales, George Reid, a crafty Sydney politician. Reid wanted to keep commerce free and attacked tariffs with arguments that would be used 80 years later.
They created the evil of vested interests. They corrupted politics. They taxed the poor. And worst of all, interfere with the free play of private enterprise.
Deakin defended tariffs with the same passion.
Under protection, Victoria has reared a number of industries which are still unable to sustain the shock of free competition. High duties on these products must be retained or they perish.
Deakin's protectionists and Reid's free traders were the main parties in the first Parliament. Labour was the smallest party. After a year of argument, the Parliament voted for protection. Deakin would prevail over Reid. H.B. Mackay would win protection for his harvester.
Many other countries were highly protectionist and believed that they should set themselves up as an island. But I think Australia went to unusual lengths to try to protect everything.
Protection would become the Australian way. For 7 decades, every product from the factory and the farm would be protected by tariffs or subsidies. When Deakin became Prime Minister in 1903, he embarked on the next stage of the fair go, the right to a fair wage. An arbitration court would be created. Its aim was to reduce strikes, deliver wage justice, and curb class conflict.
This bill marks, in my opinion, the beginnings of a new phase of civilization.
For nearly 5 hours, Deakin held a full house, entranced by a brilliant exposition of a new world which was to be called into being, with a president who would be part messiah, part social worker, part stern dispenser of justice, and wholly angelic. Herbert Campbell-Jones, journalist.
Deakin handpicked Henry-born Higgins as the first president of the Arbitration Court. Higgins was soon given his chance to enshrine Australia as a haven of wage justice. It came courtesy of Hugh Victor Mackay. By 1905, Mackay was producing 2,000 harvesters a year and was in competition with the American giant, the International Harvester Company. Mackay lobbied for even higher protection.
Australians, See your money spent in your own country. See industries grow up in your own districts. To give employment to your sons and to the sons of your sons.
Protection was now a creed and a vote winner. The government gave Mackay his protection. This guaranteed his profits. But Deakin and the Labour Party imposed a critical proviso. Mackay had to convince the arbitration court he paid his workers a fair and reasonable wage. Justice Higgins was presiding. He would establish a principle that would last a century. Higgins heard evidence about the needs of working families. He assumed men were the breadwinners and women their dependents.
I am a married woman living with my husband at Port Melbourne. He gives me £3 a week. I have myself, husband and 7 children to keep on that. My grocery list would include £6 of butter, 2 tins of jam, packets of flour, soap, glue and potatoes. As to the gas, I have a penny in the slot system. I am not always able to keep the family in boots and clothing. Mrs. Mary Smith.
With very rudimentary statistical tools and methodology, they came up with, you know, the man, wife and 2 children. What did they need? And they looked at it under rent and clothing, etc. And it was a very meticulous, thoroughgoing exercise that he undertook with limited statistical tools.
All rise.
Higgins found against Mackay. He said that Mackay's wage of 36 shillings for a 6-day week was not enough. The minimum wage should be 42 shillings a week.
I cannot think of any other standard appropriate than the normal needs of the average employee, regarded as a human being living in a civilized community. The applicant seems to me to have fallen into the practice of not spending more in the payment of his employees than is sufficient to induce them to work for him.
Mackay was furious. He launched a High Court challenge, and the court found in his favour. Mackay won the battle, but Higgins would win the war. The Harvester judgment would ultimately prevail. It said that wages should be based on the principle of human needs, not what the employer could afford to pay.
The philosophy was so right and so in tune with the Australian ethos that it spread not just through the federal jurisdiction but then became embraced by the various state jurisdictions. And I think it's impossible to overstate the significance of both the judgment and its author, Henry Bourne Higgins.
The creation of protection and arbitration went hand in hand with the rise of labour. In his nation building, Deakin had collaborated with the emerging Labour Party.
Deakin and his Liberals shared the same legislative aims as Labor. They believed in protection, they supported the arbitration system, they believed that government had a creative role to play in developing the institutions of the new nation.
The rise of the Labour Party and working class consciousness would transform Australia. Between Federation and World War I, trade union coverage rose from 5% to 34%.
The surging tide of Labour politics threatened to inundate the federal parliament. Miners, labourers, compositors, watchmakers, they had struggled to their places, despite little education, long hours, and few recreations. Most of them had carried their lives in their hands. Herbert Campbell-Jones, journalist.
The Labour threat would force an historic merger between two enemies, the Free Trade Party of George Reed and Deakin's protectionists. Deakin sympathised with Labour, but feared its class appeal. The non-Labour parties had to unite or be devoured by Labour.
The Labour Party dominates Australian politics. They constitute a caste in politics and refuse to support representatives who have not been selected among their own number.
It was a very unstable period. Coalitions were necessary. Parties changed sides. So there was always an inevitability that two sides would come out of this, two parties.
On Empire Day, 24th of May 1909, Deakin realised his plan. A merger between the protectionists and the free traders to form a new Liberal Party, with Deakin as Prime Minister for a third time. He now had the numbers to overthrow Andrew Fisher's Labour government. The effect was electric.
The galleries were full. Mr. Deakin strolled into the chamber at 2:30 p.m. with an easy self-confidence, and all eyes followed his movements. The cheers had not subsided when, with flashing eyes and bristling hair, a voice, "Judas, Judas, Judas." Melbourne Age.
Deakin destroyed the Labour government on the floor of Parliament. This was a savage debate, wild and vituperative. Labour's Billy Hughes turned on Deakin.
What a career his has been. In his hands at various times have rested the banners of every party in this country. He has proclaimed them all. He has betrayed them all.
There was a new contest in Australian politics, Labour versus Liberal. It would last for the rest of the century. But Labour and Liberal had been joint creators of the fair go system. Deakin was its ultimate symbol. He had worked with Labour in the cause of an egalitarian Australia. He died in 1919, the dominant Prime Minister of Australia's foundation age.
Alfred Deakin is scarcely a household name today, but he is one of Australia's few great Prime Ministers. Deakin and his generation put in place the ideas and institutions that would govern Australia for nearly a century: protection, arbitration, and a paternalistic state. But this system, the work of Liberal and Labor politicians, was about to face the worst peacetime crisis in Australia's history, the Great Depression.
In the late 1920s, Australia was in trouble. Its nation building had been financed by overborrowing and export prices had collapsed. The fair go system was about to buckle. Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Melbourne Bruce decided to cut wages and confront the unions. Bruce became the only Prime Minister to try to dismantle arbitration. In October 1929, his government was swept away and Bruce lost his seat. Labour was euphoric. Its new Prime Minister was James Scullin, an innocent being led to the slaughter. 12 days after Labour's victory came the Great Wall Street crash. Scullin never recovered. The teetotaler Scullin took a suite at the Hotel Canberra. He was delivered dismal news.
I was staggered. The overseas debt had increased by £53 million, and a similar sum had been borrowed by the 6 state governments. These obligations had to be met at a time when prices had tumbled and the volume of exports had fallen.
Australia was threatened with bankruptcy.
Australia suffered more in the 1930s than any other country, with the exception of Canada and Germany. We had an unemployment rate that reached 30% and was 20% for a long period of time. National income fell by almost a half. Capital dried up completely. Commodity prices fell by 2/3.
In London, where Australia had overborrowed, there was alarm. The Bank of England said Australia was living beyond its means. It criticised Australia's high tariffs and arbitration system. A senior official, Sir Otto Niemeyer, was dispatched to pull Australia into line.
Niemeyer's primary view was that we had acted irresponsibly in the past. There'd been a lot of press in England which spoke about government's reckless borrowing and undisciplined behaviour. He would have picked all of that up, and did pick it up.
Niemeyer met federal and state ministers in Melbourne in August 1930. He proposed severe cuts in wages, spending and living standards.
Australia has a maximum period of 2 years in which to put her house straight. I assume that everybody in this room is in agreement that costs must come down.
The working class would bear the brunt of the Niemeyer plan. There was no political will in Australia to swallow this medicine. Australians were suffering.
The men just rotted in soul-destroying idleness and frustration. A heartbreaking time. Nothing but the dole for subsistence. No money to go places. Just a sort of deadly hopelessness that caused a feeling of inferiority that some men never got over. Mrs. D. Evans, New South Wales.
Scullin decided to go to London to plead his case. Unemployment continued to climb, and his government now began to disintegrate. Scullin left the Conservative Joseph Lyons as acting treasurer.
It did not take many months to convince political observers in Canberra that Mr. Lyons was no more a Labor man than was Canberra a city on the moon. Warren Denning, Canberra Press Gallery.
In a dramatic meeting in October 1930, Lyons tried to win caucus approval of the Niemeyer plan. But there was a party revolt. The caucus would not agree to savage cuts in living standards. It wanted instead to defer loan repayments.
You want to cut everything and everybody except the bankers and the bondholders.
It was too much for Joe Lyons.
I will not do it. It is default.
Well, default and be damned.
I tell you, I will not be a party to it. I will go out of public life first. I will cable the Prime Minister, and if he wants it done, he must get someone else to do it.
Lyons left Parliament House white-faced. He was finished with Labour. Within months, Lyons would defect and be recruited as the next non-Labour Prime Minister. Nehemiah wrote off Australia.
The personnel all round, political, administrative, and banking, is, with rare exceptions, lamentable. A circumstance which is accentuated by the marooning of the Commonwealth government and administration on a sheep run 200 miles from anywhere. The political leaders are listless and fragmented, and quite incapable of giving a lead.
After 5 months away, Scullin tried to rally a country in disarray.
And if you display that confidence and show the sterling character of the Australian people, other people in other parts of the world will have confidence in us, and we will rise out of our difficulties and our depression.
But the economy was getting worse.
Sydney was a city of ghosts. More than any other part of Australia, it was feeling the rigours of the Depression. Pitt Street, with lines of barrows, had become almost an open market.
Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen, the finest boot polish that you have ever seen. You bet,
Customers were few, and dispirited vendors walking slowly homeward at the day's end wondered whether it was worthwhile to come again tomorrow. Damien at Lyons.
A desperate Scullin now turned to former Queensland Premier Edward Red Ted Theodore.
A penetrating thinker with an original mind, Mr. Theodore failed to estimate the strength of the forces working against him. Warren Denning.
Theodore had been Scullin's first treasurer, but was sidelined for 6 months for alleged fraud. The outstanding figure in the government, with a rare insight into the crisis, Theodore devised a new position, an expansionary policy to stimulate production and attack unemployment.
Everyone must contribute to the loss which the Commonwealth is suffering in order to save the country from worse disaster and possible financial collapse.
Theodore's plan was Labour's last chance, but it was destroyed by New South Wales Labour Premier Jack Lang. Among the rank and file, Lang was a hero.
I learned some things from him about political energy. If you want to be in the business of throwing thunderbolts, you may as well try to look as much like Zeus as you can. And he really did. He knew all about that.
At the February 1931 Premiers' Conference, Lang produced his own plan, a refusal to pay interest on money owed to London, to default.
They wanted us to extract that money out of the blood of the people who toil. They wanted to reduce the incomes of everybody in Australia to pacify the hunger of the bondholder in a foreign country. I would not agree to it. They were not Labour principles.
Theodore was nearer to being right than Lang. Lang was dead wrong. He was dead wrong because Australia was part of the international economy, and to withdraw Australia from it would have produced a peasant-type system.
The Langites savaged Scullin and defected to become the Lang Labour Party. With the departure of Joe Lyons and the Lang supporters, Labour was now split from both the right and the left. Scullin and Theodore persisted with their economic plan, but it was doomed. The winner in this struggle now made his play. It was Sir Robert Gibson, chairman of the Commonwealth Bank, Australia's central bank.
This cautious old Scotsman was more definitely Prime Minister of Australia than Mr. Scullin was at any time. Sir Robert Gibson possessed a supreme confidence in his own opinion and a granite-like capacity to withstand every assault. Warren Denning.
Gibson, an advocate of deep cuts in living standards, had been Nehemiah's greatest supporter. Gibson and the Commonwealth Bank Board defied the government. They refused to finance Theodore's credit expansion.
A point is being reached beyond which it would be impossible for the bank to provide further financial assistance for the government in the future.
Theodore was outraged.
There is an attempt on the part of the bank to arrogate to itself the supremacy over the government, which, I am sure, was never contemplated by the framers of the Australian Constitution.
The Senate backed Gibson and rejected Theodore's plan. The Labour government was now broken. The hard money men had won. Labour, after just 2 years in office, was swept from power.
There was no easy solution for Australia, but there was certainly a lack of imagination and a heavy reliance on dogma. As far as the institutions were concerned, say the Commonwealth Bank, say the arbitration system, say the protective system of tariffs, all of those were unable to respond to the challenges very effectively.
The Depression was Labor's greatest failure. It split the party and broke its heart. Labor had spent 30 years telling people the government would secure their future, but the government had failed them. The Depression left two great legacies within the Labor Party: a deep suspicion of banks, which lasted until the Hawke government, and a determination to succeed where Scullin had failed, to eradicate the evil of unemployment.
It was the war 8 years later that finally eradicated the Depression. Australia was mobilised. In 1941, there was a new Labour government led by John Curtin. Curtin never forgot the ravages of the Depression. His government had two aims, not just to win the war, but to plan the peace.
Labour believes that the war involves for it more vital principles than for any other class in Australia.
He wanted to see a new, better, fairer Australia. And during the darkest days of the war, he gathered together some of the best minds in the country under the leadership of Nugget Coombs, the Department of Post-War Reconstruction. And he was, in the depths of war, was planning for this new and better Australia.
An Irish Catholic train driver was Curtin's treasurer and the first post-war Reconstruction minister. Joseph Benedict Chifley was a genuine true believer.
The oppression left a bitterness in my heart that time cannot eradicate. I saw hundreds of men queued up outside the Lithgow Small Arms Factory gate, all after one job. I cannot forget how miserable those hundreds of thousands of men must have felt when they went back each night to their families after tramping the streets all day in search of work.
Chifley and Curtin set out to create jobs for all Australians. The centrepiece was the 1945 White Paper on Full Employment. It was a break with the past. Australia had lived with high unemployment since the Great War.
It was very important. It grew out of a belief in the capabilities of government intervention to create conditions of full employment. something that always has been debated and is still being debated to this day as to how valid that is. But there was a belief that government could create these conditions.
For the next 30 years, Australia would have unemployment under 3%. Governments embraced the ideas of British economist John Maynard Keynes. It was a new approach to deliver the fair go, with governments controlling the level of demand to create full employment. It would become Australia's most successful attempt to civilise capitalism.
In a sense, we were all Keynesians. Some of us would have been proud of the title, others would have denied it, but there was no doubt that the influence of Keynes's ideas was very pervasive amongst the Liberals and Country Party people, as well as amongst the Labor Party.
On Curtin's death, Chifley became Prime Minister.
As Prime Minister of Australia, I desire to carry on the great work that was begun by John Curtin.
But Chifley was not satisfied with purging the unemployment legacy of the Depression.
The great task that confronted us.
He wanted to win Labour's war with the banks. It was a glorious spring Saturday in August 1947 when Chifley asked his cabinet ministers to attend a special meeting. There were no cabinet papers. The High Court had just ruled to emasculate part of Labour's bank laws. Chifley said the government had a choice to accept the decision or to nationalise the banks.
Chiff leaned forward, elbows on the table and pipe in mouth. There was a cold silence. No minister said a word for the moment. They had never contemplated such action. Within the space of 10 minutes or so, all ministers had expressed a view in favour of nationalisation of the trading banks of Australia. Truth, 24th of August, 1947.
The news was carried by the Saturday afternoon papers. The banks and the country were stunned.
I heard the newspaper boy, extra, banks to be nationalised. I just got such a shock. I'd only been back in banking for about 3 or 4 months after the conclusion of my service in the army, and thought I was safe and secure back home again with the job I had for a short time before the war, with no worry about security to the future, and I was shocked to find that this was all suddenly under threat.
Chifley had always believed in bank nationalisation. It had been Labour policy since 1921.
These were great men, but great men can make mistakes. I think the attempt to nationalise the banks was an emotional reaction and was not, sensible economic policy, and it certainly wasn't sensible political policy.
On the evening of the 15th of October 1947, the galleries of Parliament House were overflowing as Chifley introduced his bill.
Full public ownership of the banks will ensure control of banking in the public interest. It will assist us to stave off depression and to avoid a repetition of the miseries of 1930.
Under the bill, all private banks would be transferred to public ownership. Private banking would be prohibited. Everybody would bank with the Commonwealth. On the opposition benches was the leader of the Liberal Party, Robert Gordon Menzies. He was now hero for a new cause, saving Australia from socialism.
Let nobody suppose that these aspiring dictators will rest content with the destruction of the banks.
The campaign against nationalisation became a crusade. Thousands of protest meetings were held. The banks mobilised their staff, their shareholders, depositors and borrowers.
I was working in the school holidays in Colac, driving a tractor in Western Victoria, and my uncle was very interested in bank nationalisation, and he said there's a big meeting in Colac that night. And I went in, I think I was age 16, to this meeting, and it revived me. It reminded me of a revivalist crusade, the sense of urgency in the air, the belief that the whole way of life of Australia was under challenge.
The banks went to the High Court to argue that Chifley's nationalisation law was unconstitutional. They won, both in the High Court and in the Privy Council. Next, the banks aimed to win at the 1949 election.
They felt, yes, let's get the legal verdict, but that won't help us because the government of the day can amend the legislation to fit the legal restraints. We've got to get rid of the government, and we've got to fight this boots and all.
Chifley and Menzies went head-to-head.
On December the 10th, you'll be called upon to decide between two ways of living. One is the socialist way, with regimentation, compulsion, and complete control. The alternative to socialism is the free, democratic way of life, with full employment assured by full production.
Mr. Menzies is such a good-looking man, and he speaks so nicely. Anyway, you get fined £2 if you don't vote.
Labour was defeated convincingly.
The Labour government is overthrown. In comes Robert Gordon Menzies, the Liberal leader, as Australia's new Premier. Out goes Joseph Benedict Chifley, Premier for 8 years. The election campaign had been bitter and hard-hitting. One of the major issues had been nationalisation of the banks.
Chifley's post-war reconstruction was a great success and a great failure. Full employment was the great success. The attempt to introduce socialism, the great failure. Labour would be relegated to opposition for 23 long, bitter years.
Chifley's stewardship of the Curtin legacy was, I believe, Labour, good-hearted but flat-footed. And essentially, we gave it. We built the post-war structure and gave it to the Liberal Party, to Menzies.
Robert Menzies had defeated socialism. But Menzies was a believer in the liberal tradition of Alfred Deakin, government intervention to regulate the economy and promote social stability.
This is my first broadcast to you as the new Prime Minister. We shall esteem it our simple duty to do justice to all Australians, to cultivate good relations between employer and employee, to regard the great trade unions as our cooperators in the production of industrial justice, to make ordinary men and women feel that government is their friend and not their oppressor.
Labor had been the government which had started to embrace Keynesianism, where the government would have a greater role in the management of the economy, which had started to expand social welfare services, which had embarked on large government-sponsored nation-building projects. Menzies kept all of this in place.
Menzies presided over a new golden age, the result of the post-war international boom. He would be Prime Minister for 16 years and win 7 elections, a record never likely to be beaten.
In 1939, the typical Australian did not believe that they would have a job in most years of their working life. They believed that they would never own a refrigerator, they would never own a motor car, they would probably never own their own house. Then in the 1950s, these miracles began to take place, and the average Australian battler entered a world that previously was completely out of bounds.
Menzies' great achievement has hardly been recognised. He perfected the Australian art of civilising capitalism, and he made it work longer and better than anyone else. Menzies, the great champion of private enterprise, believed in protection, arbitration, the welfare state, the full employment economy, and great public enterprises like the Commonwealth Bank. He expanded significantly the role of national government in Canberra, and he transformed the university system. But Menzies' Australia would not last.
Under Menzies, protection was increased and reached its pinnacle. Its champion was Country Party leader John Blackjack McEwen.
Oh, he's a magnificent performer if ever he were a candidate for the Oscar. John Wayne and Sir Lawrence Olivier would never be in it.
McEwen, Trade Minister for 21 years, had a deep faith in protection, regulation and arbitration.
Today, the Country Party overwhelmingly is composed of farmers in industry who, one way and another, need protection and have secured protection.
By the 1970s, Australia had some of the highest and least sustainable tariffs in the world. Australia was in economic decline compared with other nations. The tariff operated as a harsh tax on consumers, exporters and industry. Its cost was estimated at the equivalent of $2.7 billion. More than all governments were spending on health, welfare, education and defence combined.
But of course, the tariff system was completely abused. John McEwen, who was a very effective and strong leader, he would try to get support from secondary industry, that is all-round protection. I must say he debauched the system.
In the beginning, there was Gough.
Gough Whitlam came to shatter the established order.
And darkness was upon the face of the electorate until the spirit of Gough moved over Lake Burley Griffin.
He was the first Labour leader to support low tariffs. His 25% tariff cut stunned industry and unions and provoked a savage backlash. Whitlam lasted only 3 years.
I was very, very critical of the way it was done. There was zilch consultation with the trade union movement. And I think that was stupid. And that was one of the reasons why it was so controversial.
But the world economy was being transformed. When a new-look Labour Party won the 1983 election, the collapse of protected Australia was at hand.
You've got to have a more market-orientated economy, because if you think that you can simply put up high tariff barriers and have some sort of command-type economy, well, just look around the world. It's never worked anywhere, and it wouldn't work here.
Fortress Australia died on Friday the 9th of December, 1983.
The decision to float means that the speculators will now be speculating against themselves rather than against the Australian government via the Reserve Bank.
Treasurer Paul Keating announced the float of the Australian dollar. It was the most important decision taken by the Hawke government.
I wanted very much a much more market mixed focus in our economic policy. That is, one where we drop this pretense about economic planning and the notion that, you know, state intervention and state capitalism, you know, and then we actually said, look, this is not going to produce the goods.
deregulation of the exchange rate unleashed a tidal wave. It swept through much of the economy. Hawke and Keating turned Labour policy on its head. They deregulated the banks, freed up capital movements, and sold the Commonwealth Bank. Chifley's legacy was buried.
G'day, Bob. I've just dropped in to sign the visitors book. Anything happening?
Nothing that need concern you, Bill. I'm just optimising a few resources.
Gee, does that mean you're retiring?
No, Bill, I'm just running a bit of a garage sale. Qantas, Australia Airlines, Commonwealth Bank.
But, Bob, it's our psyche.
What?
Our psyche, our zeitgeist, our je ne sais quoi, our platonic essence.
Then we ought to get a good price for it, Bill? That's what happens when you sell your soul.
What was Labor really in economic terms before 1983? As a party that believed in regulation, it believed in the regulation of the banking system, it believed in regulation of the exchange rate, it believed in tariffs. We had low profits, therefore low investment, we had high unemployment. I mean, what have we abandoned? It's like losing an eczema.
The way forward for Australia is not to be closeted and sheltered, but to be open and dynamic, trading aggressively in the world.
In decisions taken in 1988 and 1991, Hawke and Keating dismantled the protection legacy of the past 90 years. They set Australia on a free trade future.
Accordingly, the government will peel away more of this protection.
Alfred Deakin's legacy had surrendered to George Reed's vision. The old icons would be lost. H.V. Mackay's Sunshine Harvester Works stopped production. But Australia's economic decline was reversed. Incomes rose and Australian exports surged.
If you look at that last 20 years, you've really got 5 pillars. I think you've got financial reform, tariff reform, industrial relations reform, fiscal consolidation, and finally, and importantly, taxation reform. Now, all of those things were necessary. Without them, this country wouldn't have survived the Asian economic downturn.
John Howard became the first Liberal Prime Minister to champion a pro-market economy.
My government took off.
Protection and arbitration had risen together. The issue now was whether they would fall together.
It happened in the dead of night. Workers looking on in stunned silence as security guards filed onto the docks with German Shepherd and Doberman attack dogs. The workers realised they'd been sacked.
The Howard government wanted to deregulate the wage system and weaken the trade unions.
We got to keep suffering through you assholes.
It met fierce resistance. For most of the century, more than 50% of Australian workers were unionists. Today, with its coverage at 26% of the workforce, the unions claim to be fighting the final battle for egalitarianism. The global revolutions in technology and finance have created new opportunities. The new workplace demands fresh skills, flexibility, and knowledge. But tensions are being created between bush and city, between skilled and unskilled workers. Government is less important, and the fair go is under assault.
The toughest one is how do you re-establish some kind of egalitarian society? Because it's the great, the large, the wealthy who've become more powerful, and others have been pushed aside.
We won't be able to stop the disparities. You can ameliorate them, you won't be able to stop them, but we can lift the average. We can lift the floor.
The idea of the fair go was enshrined in the new Commonwealth. 100 years later, a new Australia is being formed. Wealthier, more dynamic, but less equal. The question is, are Australians seeing the end of the fair go?
For nearly a century, Australia conducted a unique experiment to civilise capitalism. It was a quest for prosperity and egalitarianism together. But the old system has been swept away by a new capitalism, which is more creative, yet more destructive. Australia's challenge now is to create a new system, a marriage between a market economy and a decent social order. This won't be easy, but it's the only way. It will require leaders as visionary as the nation builders of 100 years ago.
In a moment, a look at 100 years for next week. The examination of our history continues on radio with 100 Years, the Australian story, heard Sunday afternoons at 2 o'clock on Radio National. And for more details, visit the website via ABC Online. Just go to abc.net.au/100 years. You can find the video and book from the series at ABC shops and centres. Stay with us now for Foreign Correspondent.